parts. So welcome back. This is going to be in two parts because I'm stupid and didn't realize if you get a phone call, it apparently shuts down the recording. So no clue what we've missed. So I'll have to go back and fill in. I've just been talking about the civil service examination system, and probably you folks at home mercifully missed my Google Earthing of the Forbidden City, and that's it. But I was just about to talk about what do young men study for these exams. Primarily, you would study the works of Confucius, the so-called Confucian classics. Confucianism it's not an institutional religion. It's not really a religion at all. It's more of a combined system of a moral philosophy that lays out guidelines how you should live, morally speaking. And also it's a political philosophy concerned with how emperors should rule. Go back to what I said about the mandate of heaven and the idea that there are obligations that the emperor and the dynasty have. Those obligations are established based upon the writings and teachings of Confucius. I should say teachings. His writings are written down by his followers. His teachings are written down by his followers. He lived, Confucius himself, in 300, 400 BC, and held forth ideas about, again, how to live and how to govern that are taken down by his followers and become a canon. That is, a collection of works that are deemed to be essential, foundational, fundamental. Now, there's no church-state split in China because there is no institutionalized church at all. Nothing akin to what you would see like the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. But the state does take responsibility for people's moral well-being. That's part of the obligations of the mandate of heaven, of holding on to that. And that's based upon Confucian thought. The dynasty, the imperial administration, they have the responsibility and obligation to govern justly and morally. As I've said, the emperor must be diligent. The emperor must be not too lenient, but not too strict. The emperor must honor principle. And the emperor must, above all, honor tradition. This is very important. Throughout Chinese history, there is the tendency to fall back on tradition. This is understandable because, and we're just picking up here with the Yuan and the Ming, but if you take my World One, we've got thousands of years of Chinese dominance of Asia with no rival. That's what separates China from, England or Spain or France, who always have rival neighbor kingdoms and nations that China never does up to this point. And so anytime something seems threatened, you just fall back on tradition or the way it's always been, because China has always been the celestial empire. And that's part of the teachings of Confucius, to honor tradition. And if you are the emperor and you're the ruling dynasty, you honor the way that it's always been so. But for these young men taking the exams, of course, the writings of Confucius are concerned with obviously much more than just what specifically the emperor is supposed to do. And they would combine the wisdom of Confucius with other areas of study, from mathematics to engineering and history and so on. And they would spend literally their young lives studying to just take these exams. No pressure. You think the ACT was bad? How about having the weight of your family name and your village on your shoulders as you go to take these exams, knowing that if you fail or do poorly, you're going to bring shame upon all of those people, but you could do really well and bring great pride and glory to your people, yeah? Such was the civil service examination system, which creates a system or classification, a class, if you will, of scholar officials. Officials, bureaucrats, who are also scholars. That's the nature of the system. To put in these positions the people who are best suited intellectually, scholastically to do these jobs. What a great way to run an empire. It makes perfect sense, right? You don't get this position because of who you are or how much money you got. You get it because of how good you're going to do the job. How well you're going to do the job based upon what we know from these examinations and your study of the classics and other writings. But in the long run, this could be one of the things that works to China's detriment. And I'll probably keep that, an explanation of that, in my back pocket until the end. So just remember that we need to return to, what could be bad in the long run about having a class of scholar officials under the civil service examination system, and what might ultimately work to China's detriment when it comes to always falling back on tradition. I know we've already Google Earthed China, but this is, I suppose, a more period-specific, if a little cartoonish, map of the world in 1500. And you can see the areas ruled over by the Ming. South of the Gobi Desert, Yellow and Yangtze River valleys, not yet Tibet or what would become Shenzhen. That being said, what this map doesn't show you is all of the peoples around China that would be within China's tributary empire. That would be those peoples or kingdoms who had agreed to send tribute to the Son of Heaven, and who had agreed to come and send emissaries to kowtow before the emperor and to prostrate themselves and offer that tribute. So it was really, if there's one individual who, for the Ming specifically, decides to reinvigorate this meritocratic civil service examination system, it's the Yongle Emperor, the third Ming Emperor, who rules from 1402 to 1424. But ironically, rather than rely on those scholar officials as his closest confidants and advisors, he instead relies upon certain eunuchs. Anybody want to explain what a eunuch is? You're going to make me do it. Anybody know what a eunuch is? Did any of y'all watch Game of Thrones? Nobody? Oh, well, that's a strikeout. Okay. A couple of major characters in that series are eunuchs. So a eunuch is someone, a male, who has had certain anatomical parts removed, if you follow. They have had things that, parts that would identify you as a male removed. With the thinking being, this is a tradition that's not unique to China. If you have imperial rule, if you have an emperor, a king, or a queen, and you want to maintain the integrity of that rule, you don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of people, specifically men, who can procreate and create heirs, and so you take away their ability to procreate. Or if you want to have close advisors around you, but who are reminded that they are servants to you, slaves perhaps even, at an early age, you could provide them with something that would be a lifelong reminder that they are servants and slaves to you. They need only look down every day to be reminded of that. And so was Zheng He. Zheng He is from those western regions of China today that China under the Ming had not yet conquered, but there were military expeditions out there. He's actually of Arab and Mongolian descent himself. But he is taken as a slave as a young boy. He's castrated. and becomes a servant to a young prince. You remember in the film where they talk about Suleiman and Ibrahim Pasha, and how Ibrahim Pasha becomes the servant to Suleiman when he's just a prince, but then Suleiman becomes this great sultan, and that puts Ibrahim Pasha like in this really important position of power because they're like best friends. Similar thing happens here with Zheng He, because the prince that he is attached to ultimately becomes the Yongle emperor. And he is put in various positions of power, culminating in his becoming this great admiral, if you will. He is a seafarer. He is, you might say, an explorer of sorts. And he is put in charge of leading massive expeditions by sea. He leads 7 of these expeditions, in any given one of which there could be as many as 20,000 men on massive ships and multiple ships, dozens of ships, the largest sail-powered vessels in human history that set out into the Indian Ocean and beyond. So this is a caravel. Remember that? Portuguese sailing ships that become the model for Europeans who sailed into and explored the so-called New World. That's one of the ships that Zheng He would have commanded. We're talking about multiple ships of that size with tens of thousands of soldiers and other functionaries sailing all throughout the Indian Ocean. 7 separate expeditions or voyages to Vietnam and Burma, to India, to modern-day Indonesia and the Spice Islands, to the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, to Persia, to Ethiopia, down to the trading city-states of South or East Africa, south of the Horn of Africa, and Somalia, to Mecca and Medina. What is the purpose of these massive voyages? It's not for trade. It's not for colonization either. It's not even necessarily for conquest, despite the fact that he does have so many men with him. The Yongle Emperor was, in addition to being keenly interested in what was out there in the world beyond China's borders, keenly interested in growing China as a tributary empire. That's what these expeditions are really about. Seeking out contact with other people, showing them that very clearly you are the Celestial Empire. You need only look at this massive fleet of gigantic ships and tens of thousands of soldiers to be awed by the power of China, and the power of the Ming Dynasty and the Son of Heaven himself. The idea is to get other peoples to send tribute back to China, to get them to turn around and send delegations of emissaries to the Forbidden City to kowtow before the emperor and acknowledge that he's the Son of Heaven. Again, to grow China as a tributary empire. And so successful were these voyages that indeed people from Arabia and Africa and Southeast Asia and Indochina do turn around and send delegations to China to pay tribute. Indeed, they revere in some places Zheng He himself as a god. They build statues to Zheng He. Because of the great majesty projected by these fleets and these expeditions. There's a statue of Zheng He right there. Now, we're in the early 1400s here. When did Christopher Columbus bump into the Bahamas? Roughly.
1600? Right?
Earlier than that. Later than this, so you're on the right track in that regard. The late 1492. That was the moment he bumps into land there, and there are subsequent expeditions, and then the Portuguese get really active. In the 1500s, though, they had already been sailing down the African coastline, and so on. The point here is, this is before all of that. This is 100 years before Christopher Columbus, with ships that are bigger, with more ships and way more people. But the expeditions are put on pause in the 1430s, and the Yongle Emperor dies, and his son comes to power and decides that these expeditions, if you're an emperor and you're concerned with running the state, and yeah, these expeditions are resulting in you getting tribute, and that has value, was there something about expeditions of this size that might concern you if you're like trying to consider your imperial budget, for example? He considers them to be ruinously expensive, and to him, a waste of money, arguing that the tribute brought in does not offset the massive cost of maintaining these expeditions. And so he puts an end to them. Not to mention, Zheng He's his father's friend, right? His father's close confidant, not his. And they are never resumed. And then, beginning in 1492, Europeans began exploring the New World. What's the great what if here? The great counterfactual historians like to consider. What might you guess would have unfolded differently in terms of world history had these expeditions not been discontinued by the Yongle Emperor's son? China probably would have discovered the New World first. If these expeditions had been allowed to continue and had extended out subsequently farther than each previous expedition, you can make a damn good case, and historians have done this, that China almost inevitably would have discovered the New World before Europeans did. And don't you think world history would have turned out a hell of a lot different in that case? But they weren't. And so we're left only to wonder what might have been. Other things to consider in terms of why these were discontinued. Consider in the case of Europeans, once Amerigo Vespucci and others realized what Columbus had done was stumble upon an entirely new world to them, they seek out wealth in the Americas, right? I mean, you have voyages of conquest, of course, that we looked at with the Spanish. But if we're talking about the French and the English and others that followed, those expeditions are being pushed by merchants. They establish a system that we'll look at later known as mercantilism or merchantilism that is beneficial to them. In China, merchants are looked down upon. The honorable thing to do as a young man is to study the Confucian classics, take the civil service exam, not to become a lowly merchant. Merchants were not nearly as influential in China as they were in Europe. And so if you have something like this that might have been pushed by a merchant class, well, the emperors aren't listening to the merchant class. And in this case, you have this more or less absolute monarch who, if he decides you don't want to continue, you're not going to continue. Okay, what are other ways to view what happens with Europeans in the New World? Well, they were establishing vast networks of trade. Or let me ask you this. Go all the way back. What was Columbus trying to do? What were the Portuguese trying to do? Where were they trying to go? When Columbus sails west or when Portuguese sails south around Africa, where were they trying to get to? China, right? This is maybe the biggest point of all. Everybody is coming to you if you're China. Europeans are falling all over themselves to establish direct trade networks or connections with you. In other words, you don't have to go sailing all around the world because everybody else is doing it to come to you. Does that make sense? What motivation do you have to send another massively expensive Zheng He expedition across the Atlantic Ocean? Just to see what's there? There's no need for you to be out establishing some vast trade network of your own when everybody's coming to you. And furthermore, what the expeditions that Zheng He had been allowed to carry out had done is just to expand the tributary network, which in essence is a form of trade, right? Finally, one more thing to consider in terms of things that were motivating the French, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese. Think about it, it's the Portuguese who started it with Prince Henry the Navigator exploring the African coastline, trying to get around into the Indian Ocean. And then what was one big reason I gave, or consider both reasons I gave, for Fernando and Isabella to give money to Columbus to sail west to get east? Their next door neighbor is Portugal, and they're getting left behind. They have a rival that they're trying to keep up with. And the other reason was they're motivated by the desire to spread Christianity. Well, again, China has no institutional church. And China has no rivals at that time. There's nobody to keep up with. There's nobody to feel like, oh God, if we don't do this or do something else innovative, we're going to get left behind. China has no rivals. No reason to do this. That's a lot of boxes to check as to why wouldn't you just continue these expeditions? And again, we're left then to wondering, what if they had? Well, the Ming Dynasty does fall in the mid-17th century. You had a series of ineffective rulers. Remember what we said about any system of hereditary rules susceptible to having inept rulers. Corruption tends to seep in, and when that's the case, we saw this with the great Arab Muslim empires we just looked at. What did we also say happens all throughout the world when you get these massive inflows of silver and gold from the New World by the Spanish?
Inflation.
Right. So it's a fiscal crisis too, eventually there in China as there was elsewhere. They're also, the Ming, having to finance endless military campaigns to keep their warlike northern neighbors at bay, most especially the Manchus. Mongol threat is gone, but you have a new one in the form of the Manchus, who, just like the Mongols before them, lived on the other side of the Great Wall and were a quasi-nomadic, horseback-riding, warlike peoples. When the Ming is facing that threat and then faces at the very same time a revolt of its own peasants on the northern frontier regions, it's too much. The Ming government raised taxes and peasants revolt against those taxes. They're able to consolidate control of the north of China and even take the capital of Beijing in the 1630s, at which point they are overtaken, the peasant rulers, by the invading Manchus, who claim to take up the mandate of heaven and proclaim themselves to be the Qing dynasty. In 1644. Key thing to know about the Manchus who become the Qing dynasty, they don't simply come into China and impose their own institutions, their own cultural, their own intellectual traditions or spiritual traditions. In many cases, they adopt Chinese institutions or traditions, including obviously claiming to have taken up the mandate of heaven. Clearly, if you're facing a peasant revolt and you couldn't keep we, the outside invaders, at bay, you have lost the mandate of heaven. Heaven now bestows upon us the authority and legitimacy to rule as the Qing dynasty. It really shows you the power of Chinese institutions, political and cultural. The Manchus will govern, in fact, based upon Confucian principles. And the idea of those obligations that you're held to under the concept of the mandate of heaven. They themselves, actually the ruling Manchu peoples themselves, actually adopt a form of Buddhism, but they don't force that upon all the Chinese people. So under two great Qing rulers, Kangxi and Qianlong, the dynasty expands the empire expands dramatically. These two oversee a significant expansion of the empire. It becomes a multi-ethnic empire. They expand the tributary system. We have a map, yes. You see a different spelling of Qing there. But here we go. So you see the Yellow and Yangtze rivers here. But you don't see the Great Canal that connects them in Beijing. But this would be more traditional area ruled over by Chinese dynasties. It's the Qing that expand their rule all the way into Central Asia, including the Tibetan Plateau and what becomes the province of Xinjiang. Becomes the fourth largest empire in world history. With a massive population boom too, thanks to the period of peace brought in by Qing rule, period of stability. What else in the broad view of things, both in terms of space and time, might be helping fuel a population boom in China at this time? Introduction of new world crops like corn and potatoes. Columbian exchange, right? The Europeans bringing those crops back to the old world. And remember, the old world isn't just Europe. They could, from there, be brought into Africa and Asia too. And by the 17th century, that was certainly the case with China. Also, state-controlled commercialization, internal and foreign trade expanding significantly under the direction of the imperial government. Under the Qing, China has a somewhat government-directed, state-directed economy. You know, China had always been an agrarian society that is dominated mostly by farmers. And one of the main responsibilities of the state is to regulate agriculture to a certain extent, to make sure that you could make it through a year where there's a really bad harvest rather than having a famine. So stockpiling grain and that sort of thing. You had to show that concern for the peasantry. You wanted a prosperous peasantry, otherwise you get what brought down the Ming, which is a peasant revolt, right? All of this to say, Qing China was a regionally dominant, powerful state, the largest population in the world at that time. If I didn't mention among the institutions adopted by the Qing or the Manchus is the civil service examination system, which could sometimes be either heavily relied upon or maybe not so much so, depending upon who's in power. It's revitalized under the Qing. Well, what happens when the dynasty begins to encounter Europeans in larger numbers, and perhaps with different intentions? As we saw with the Ottomans, there's very little reason for Qing emperors to see Europeans as a threat at this time. Or to, as I think I put it in that lecture, to take Europe seriously. The Portuguese had arrived at Hong Kong in 1514. So you remember in the late 1400s, they were sailing around Africa. And I know this is a map of Zheng He's voyages, but eventually the Portuguese explore coastal India, Indonesia, and they make contact with Hong Kong down here by the early 1500s. That, by the way, that whole region, said I wasn't going to do it again, and here we are. One of the most heavily populated and densely populated regions of the world. If we go down to where Guangzhou is, there's the city of Guangzhou, what had been known to the Portuguese as Canton, and there is Macau. Shenzhen is another massive city. I mean, we're talking about this region here is like, I mean, hundreds of millions of people. It's massive. Hong Kong here had been controlled by the British for a long time. As a British territory, it reverted back to the Chinese, who promised to have a system of, a dual system of government, whereby the folks in Hong Kong could have more or less home rule and do the things as they more or less had up to that point, which would include having democracy and freedom of the press and whatnot. The Chinese Communist government doesn't have democracy or freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Right now, you may be aware, there is serious anxiety in Hong Kong that communist government is going to renege upon those promises and bring Hong Kong more under their direct control. So that's just something to keep an eye on. The point was that the Portuguese arrived there at Macau in 1514 and are regarded as a kind of novelty at first. The Chinese found these people to be uncultured and maybe even repulsive. They were initially expelled, but ultimately allowed to set up a trading base at Macau. But limited to trading there. And China would later have a similar response to the British, limiting them to trading there at Canton, what's now Guangzhou. So these people are weird, they're uncultured and uncivilized. They lack principles, they're money-hungry, lowly merchants, but I guess we'll allow them to stay here and do their trading at these two ports. But two, in addition to the merchants, there are the missionaries. You remember the Jesuits we talked about? After the Catholic Reformation, a reinvigoration of the Catholic faith, Ignatius Loyola organizing this order, Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, to not only spread the Catholic version of the faith throughout Europe, but all throughout the world. And so Jesuit missionaries end up in the New World, and they end up here in China, hoping to convert the Chinese to Christianity. The Chinese Qing emperors tolerate them and allow them to remain because they're kind of interesting. Unlike the merchants, these folks have some knowledge of things, certain technologies, or like the merchants, I guess, they have a knowledge of astronomy and geography and cartography. And two, they prove willing to adopt certain Chinese ways, to adopt Chinese dress, as you can see here, to adhere themselves to certain principles of Confucianism, which they could argue was not antithetical to their faith, because again, Confucianism is not an institutionalized religion. It's more of a moral and political philosophy. So they can argue that didn't conflict with their Roman Catholic faith. Eventually, though, it's the Pope that takes issue with this operation. The fact that you've got these high-level missionaries, highly visible missionaries, spending a lot of time over there at court, adopting Chinese customs and venerating Confucius, who is not, of course, a saint in the Roman Catholic tradition, needless to say. And the Pope ultimately recalls these missionaries, but there will be more. This is a preview of what's to come. It's a little, tiny little, 2-minute trailer of the movie that's about to unfold. The fact that you've got the Portuguese and British setting up these two little trading port operations, and you got a few Jesuit missionaries who were there for a while until the Pope calls them back. Consider that both of those things on a much more massive scale, and that's what's about to unfold in the coming century or two. Tons of Christian missionaries flooding into China, and merchants from all of the major European mother country nation states wanting more trade with China, and demanding more autonomy and authority in doing so. At the same time, those same European powers are setting up colonial empires in the New World, and in the case of the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Spanish, setting up trade networks in China's backyard. The Portuguese, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Spanish in the Philippines, The French down here in Indochina, the British in India, establishing trading relationships, colonizing these areas in many cases, bringing them under their direct control. And then if you consider what they're doing in the New World too, they established worldwide trade networks and empires. They even get involved trading between China and Japan and profiting off that. And since the end of the Zheng He expeditions, China is not a maritime power. China is not developing, naval warfare technology. China is not out there colonizing anyone in the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean or in Africa or other parts beyond their borders, except in the tributary way. What's going to happen when these merchants, missionaries, and diplomats get tired of kowtowing? What's going to happen when these European mother countries, as we'll call them, demand access to more than just a couple of ports? Considering that to the Chinese Qing rulers and the Ming before them, Europe just wasn't that important. It wasn't important to them. Why would it be? The Qing, after taking over in 1644 and claiming the mandate of heaven, they seem to be holding on to that pretty firmly. Things are going well. The population is expanding. The empire is expanding. China is still the dominant power in the region and not very concerned with other regions. China had seen the mandate of heaven taken from a people beyond their borders, sure, in the form of the Manchus, but those people, instead of imposing their own culture, adopted to the culture that was already in place, adapted to Chinese institutions. Why would China change? But, as we'll see, Qing China enters a period of severe decline, just like the Muslim world. At precisely the same time, Europeans are industrializing, expanding their commercial and colonial maritime or seaborne empires. And when Europeans, again in the form of merchants and missionaries, come back in the late 19th century, they will be the catalysts for major changes in China, including coming face to face with the reality that perhaps China was not the celestial empire after all. Questions? I think we're right on time. Anything? We good? Okay.